welcome to a really cool episode of BioLogic Science News. Today, I want to talk about the famous Galapagos Finches, the same genus of finches on the same islands that Darwin himself explored and which inspired him to create his theory of evolution by natural selection. Since Darwin's time, the unique biogeographical qualities of the Galapagos Islands have been under almost constant study. Some of the most famous studies have been conducted by the scientist couple Rosemary and Peter Grant. They've been meticulously studying the finches on one specific Galapagos island for close to 40 years. These qualities include islands that are separated enough so as to discourage heavy gene flow, and they might have different food sources that apply different evolutionary pressures on the resident finches. So as a single population of closely related finches came and colonized the Galapagos Islands, each little subpopulation had to adapt to their specific island environment. These island-specific evolutionary pressures caused the finch species to slowly diverge into the island-specific species that we see today. The most recent news that I want to talk about comes from an observational study that was conducted over several decades on a tiny Galapagos island called Daphne Major. The island is large enough that it can host a tiny but stable little ecosystem, and it's small enough that it can be studied and cataloged in its entirety with a reasonable degree of effort. This has turned the island into an evolutionary petri dish of sorts, complete with resident populations of finches that evolved to fit their island habitats. On Daphne Major, there's a native species called the Geospiza fortis, or the medium ground finch, which is just your average-sized finch. It has an average triangular beak, it's an average size, and it hangs out on the ground. There's another island, some 100 kilometers away from Daphne Major, called Santa Cruz, with a native species called the Geospiza conorostris, or the large cactus finch, which is a larger finch with a brownish beak and brown streaks at the edges of their feathers. In 1981, Rosemary and Peter Grant saw an individual conorostris finch come and colonize the island, and subsequently mate with a local fortis female finch. The hybrid mating of this foreign male with this native female created a fertile hybrid offspring. Professor Leif Andersson from Sweden's Uppsala University contributed to the study by doing genetic research on the finch species that were cataloged by Peter and Rosemary Grant as they worked in the field on Daphne Major. Professor Andersson describes his findings as surprising and unexpected. He said, and I quote, "The surprise was that we would expect the hybrid would start to breed with one of the other species on the island and be absorbed. We have confirmed that they are a closed breeding group." What this basically means is that the large cactus finch incomer mated with a ground finch native to Daphne Major and established a first generation of hybrids. This first generation of hybrid finches was the founding population, and they mated with more of the ground finches around the island to create a second generation. But this is where it gets kind of interesting. This second generation didn't mate with the ground finches. There were enough of them that they started to mate with each other. This is a case of Sympatric Speciation, because there's a slight behavioral difference between the hybrid finches, which the researchers called big bird finches, and the local ground finches. The males of this second hybrid generation, they would make bird songs in an attempt to attract a mate. But the native female finches, they didn't recognize the song, or they didn't like it. It didn't match their genetically imprinted signal for what a song from a fit, healthy male would sound like, and so they weren't attracted to it. Perhaps they didn't perceive it as something that was even meant for them, and so they ignored it. Unable to mate with the native females, these hybrid males had to mate with the other hybrid females, and they became a reproductively isolated population group. This reproductive isolation has been maintained for almost 4 decades, since the second generation emerged up until the present day. This whole time, these hybrid birds have only been reproducing with each other. They've been generating a stable gene pool of an entirely new, distinct finch species. Because the conorostris finch is generally larger than the fortis finch, these hybrid species were larger than the native ground finches. As a simple descriptor, the researchers called them the big bird population. Keep in mind that size is a very important trait differentiating species. The relatively large size of these big birds has allowed them to access resources and fill ecological roles that the native ground finch couldn't. The big bird finches can eat larger, heavier seeds, and they can break into thicker, denser plant tissue. What this means is that the big bird finches and the native ground finches don't necessarily share the same food resources. To minimize the stress and the threat from competition over a shared resource, like a particular type of food, the big bird population and the native ground finch population will adapt to specialize at eating non-overlapping food sources, or discrete food sources. They won't eat the same thing. Diet specialization to avoid competition over resources is just one of many ways in which natural selection and adaptation can fuel divergence and propel speciation. In essence, this paper is reporting on a remarkably fast case of speciation in the Galapagos finches. A single incoming individual made the difficult 100-kilometer flight from his home to Daphne Major, where he mated with local female finches and produced hybrid offspring. These hybrids struggled to attract mates from the local population due to a difference in mating songs, and thus they became reproductively isolated after the second generation. This reproductive isolation naturally led to genetic isolation, and then an evolutionary divergence that was documented for almost 40 years, with morphological studies, behavioral observations, right down to the gradual changes in the population's genetics. So not only has this created a reproductively, behaviorally, and genetically distinct species of finch, it's a paradigm-shifting example of macroscopic evolution creating new species within a single human lifetime.